The referendums announced by Russia in the 4 regions of Ukraine in the south and in the east will be very closely watched. Even as Ukraine and the West are crying foul, calling these referendums a sham, the fact remains that Russia-installed officials in these regions say that an overwhelming majority of the populations of these regions want to annex themselves with the Russian Federation, want unification with Russia. Vladimir Putin himself says that anywhere between half to 2/3 of the populations of these areas want to come back to the motherland. Remember, many of these people are original Russian speakers and had hailed from the Russian mainland and moved to these parts in search of economic opportunities. So on Crux Decode, is Putin's referendum a masterstroke? What is the ultimate purpose of these referendums? And most importantly, what could potentially be the backlash to these referendums? Now, analysts have pointed out that these referendums basically serve 2 major purposes. The number 1 purpose is to annex territory. Through these referendums, what Russia gets and what Putin gets is an area the size of Portugal. It is 90,000 square kilometers and about 3 million people. So what Putin is pulling off here basically is Crimea 2.0. Now with the referendums, Putin will annex Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. This will all now be part of the mainstream Russian Federation. It pushes Russia's borders further, it changes the map of the war, as it were, and most importantly, Putin can project this as a victory of sorts. Remember, his initial aim was to get into Kiev and change the regime there within a matter of days. Now he has to stick to rather modest gains in the south and the east. So he gets to paint this as a partial victory, if you will. Number 2, it boosts the morale of the Russian people, particularly after last week's decision, his announcement for a partial mobilization. There have been scenes of young people fleeing Russia either through flights in the few countries that were open and welcoming of Russians, or there were queues and queues of cars in the land borders, particularly in Finland as well as in the border with Azerbaijan. Again, one of the few countries that is actually allowing Russian citizens to enter without a visa. So this will help Vladimir Putin take away attention from those negative pictures of young people or hordes of young people fleeing Russia after his partial draft announcement. It's not just that. These young men of conscription age who continue to flee the country, this population from the freshly annexed areas, they could become potentially cannon fodder or potential recruits, if you will, into the Russian army. After all, Putin gets a ready and a new catchment area for recruits into the Russian military. Also, the morale of these new folks will be much more than the battered Russian military, because these people would have just voted their mind in a referendum. They would be far more inclined to fighting Ukrainian troops. However, there is a third and possibly a devastating impact that could draw itself out from these 2 objectives which I mentioned earlier, and that is psychological warfare, or PSYOPs. Essentially, soldiers who are drawn from this new pool, from these newly annexed areas, they would be Ukrainians who are willing to fight Ukrainians. Now that would be a major psychological boost for Putin's aims in Ukraine and Putin's aims in this war. And it is also a body blow to all that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government have been trying to project since the beginning of this war. The Ukrainian narrative has been that the entire country of 40 million people is united in facing the invader or in facing the aggressor, that is Russia. Because for the Ukrainians, this is an existential threat. The biggest blow to that narrative would be hordes of newly acquiesced Ukrainian men fighting the Ukrainian army. It would be a massive blow to the Ukrainian integrity project, as it were. While Ukraine has made some gains in the Kharkiv region, their gains in these 4 territories, which have gone into referendum and have essentially voted to join the Russian Federation, the gains there have been far less compared to what we've seen in Kharkiv. In fact, the people of places like Kherson and Zaporizhzhia have been waiting for a similar counter-offensive by the Ukrainian forces like we saw in Kharkiv a few weeks ago. For the people in these occupied territories, the longer they wait, the harder it becomes to survive. Many believe that the counter-offensive would happen in the month of August. It did not happen in the month of August. Then they waited till September. It did not happen in September either. Now, one of the main reasons for leaving was Russia's promise to hold these referendums, because the people in these areas fear that once the referendums are done, then the Russians will introduce new bans according to their laws, and they will try to legitimate the occupation, or they will try to legitimize the occupation. That is the fear of some of the locals who want to stay with Ukraine. Now, with cities in the south having turned into a giant military base, it is clear that the Russian troops will not abandon the south that easily. Even a silent resistance to Russian occupation is getting dangerous for the local people in this area. In September, in fact, many families were forced to send their children to Russian-speaking primary and middle schools, even though their children would have been exposed to the Kremlin's propaganda. The crackdown on people who do not support Russian rule is rising. There is a sharp increase in the number of arrests since the month of August following the successful Ukrainian airstrikes. Earlier detentions, in fact, were based on a list of names that the Russian military had. But now, anyone in these areas can be arrested and thrown into a basement for interrogation for an indefinite period of time. The self-styled referendum is bringing a new threat to the local population here. Many men could be drafted into the fight for the Russian army. Russian soldiers are already going house to house. In some villages, they're writing down names on top of doors, asking for the call-up after the referendum is over. Men aged between 18 and 35 are reportedly not allowed to leave any of these occupied territories. The Russian call-up will pose a grave challenge for the Ukrainian counter-offensive. It will certainly escalate the war, and more people will have to die. Now, the decision to hold these referendums in the face of Ukrainian advances is a clear sign that it is an escalation of the broader confrontation, not just with Ukraine, but between Russia and the West. Now, following the announcement of partial mobilization in Russia, President Vladimir Putin has once again threatened Western countries with the use of nuclear weapons. Now, what he is presenting to the West, and not necessarily to Russia, is that it's the West that is the aggressor. It is the West that has forced Russia to act in a certain way. He has framed the Ukrainian acts of self-defense as attacks on Russia. But there is another ingenious way in which Putin is twisting the narrative of this war to suit him. And that is by using the term Russian territory. The term Russian territory has been inevitably linked to what Russia defines as its territory, much like how it suddenly defined Crimea as its own territory after the 2014 annexation. Therefore, what it enables Putin and the Russian military to do is to, from time to time, dangle the threat of nuclear war, because, as per the Russian constitution, any Russian territory, if it's threatened by an invasion, by an attack by another country, then Russia is bound to use nuclear weapons as per its constitution. Just like Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it will now annex the 4 regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. The Russian fait accompli strategy is focused on the threat of use of nuclear arms to stop the West from intervening in this conflict. Now, while nuclear arms have not been used, the threat is made credible because of the use of military force, extreme violence, belligerent diplomacy, and of course, extensive psyops. Now, it is this psyops, it is this hybrid warfare which has kept the West on tenterhooks so far. The US and NATO have been bolstering Ukraine's supply lines with an unending stream of weapons. But at some point, that stream has to end, not merely because of the escalating cost, but also the escalating number of casualties. And Putin is counting on when that tap will turn dry.